Voyage to go, history. Life is a journey, being part of it is everything. Hello, my name is Jessica. Welcome to episode 23 of my historical travel podcast, Voyage to go, history, where I take you on the most adventurous journeys from the past that continue to shape our view of the world today. In this true story, 17-year-old German Georg Forster travels around the world with his father, a naturalist in the 18th century, aboard the sailing ship under the command of James Cook. Georg's travel narrative is written in the language of the 18th century. To make it more understandable, I have largely translated it into modern language. His knowledge is that of the late 18th century, so I will place some of his statements in context and provide additional information. What happened in the last episode?
In the last episode of the journey, the HMS Resolution remained anchored off the southern peninsula of Tahiti, where the crew sought to restore trust after a tense altercation involving theft and warning shots. Captain Cook's gesture of returning the captured canoes paved the way for renewed peace, though the islanders' caution lingered. Ashore, Georg and the officers experienced the island's warmth firsthand, enjoying a gracious breakfast from a generous host and discovering the intricate process behind the making of bark cloth by Tahitian women. As they ventured inland, the explorers followed a stream into the hills, where they stumbled upon one of the most picturesque scenes of their voyage, a hidden waterfall surrounded by blooming tropical flora and shaded by overhanging branches. This moment of tranquil beauty offered a deep sense of connection with the island and its natural splendor. Toward the end of the episode, Mr. Hodges and Mr. Grindle joined the naturalists. A young islander proudly carried Hodges' sketch portfolio, symbolizing the growing bond between the visitors and their hosts. In a peaceful village hut, Georg observed the serene dignity of an elderly man surrounded by his family, a glimpse into the gentle rhythm of Tahitian life. As the day closed, Georg was given a new name by the locals, Teiarrabu.
Saturday, August 21st, 1773, Tahiti.
They found hospitality in every hut, and this one was no exception. The hosts offered coconuts and evis to quench their thirst. The old man gave them a demonstration of his family's musical talent. One of the young men played a bamboo flute with 3 holes using only his nostrils, while another sang. Both the playing and singing were a repetitive alternation of 3 to 4 tones. These tones resembled neither full nor half notes, and were somewhere between half and quarter notes. There was no trace of melody or rhythm, only a monotonous humming. The music didn't offend the ear with dissonance, but it also wasn't pleasant to listen to. It was strange that despite music being a universal human trait, concepts of harmony and beauty and sound could vary so greatly between cultures. In this hut, they saw the image of true popular happiness become reality. Mr. Hodges couldn't resist sketching several scenes that would later give future generations a clearer impression of moments better felt than described. All the eyes in the hut followed his drawing hand. The joy and surprise were great when the Tahitians noticed striking resemblances between his sketches and their own faces. Though the group had tried to learn the language since arriving, they had made little progress. Conversation was limited to single words and pantomime. Still, this was enough to delight the locals. Their willingness to serve and teach was matched by the visitors' desire to please. The old man didn't change his position. Resting his head on a wooden block, he asked several simple questions, such as the name of the ship's captain, the name of their homeland, how long they would stay, and whether their women were with them. He likely already knew the answers, but may have wanted to confirm them or simply keep the conversation going. They answered as best they could, distributed some glass beads, medals, and small gifts among the family, and continued their walk. They could have traveled the entire island this way, on foot, sustained by the hospitality in every hut, and following the uninterrupted plain between the sea and the mountains. The narrow land strip was entirely level, often covered in soft grass, and no harmful animals troubled them, not even mosquitoes or biting flies. The breadfruit groves provided pleasant shade even under the midday sun, and the sea breeze helped to cool the air. Since the locals were accustomed to resting during the hottest hours, they gradually disappeared into the bushes, one by one. Only a few remained with the group. After walking about 2 more miles southeast, the visitors reached the coast, where the sea curved inland to form a small bay. All around were cultivated plots. In the middle of a grassy clearing stood a marae, a burial place, constructed from 3 tiers of stone steps. Each step was about 137 centimeters, 4.5 feet high, and all were covered with grass, ferns, and small shrubs. On the landward side, a stone wall about 91 centimeters, 3 feet high, had been stacked from tightly packed rocks. Inside this enclosure, 2 or 3 coconut palms and young casuarina trees stood alone, their drooping branches giving the whole scene a solemn and melancholy atmosphere. Near this marae, surrounded by dense bushes, they noticed a small hut called a Tupaia. Underneath it lay a dead body covered with a piece of white cloth that hung in long folds over the sides. Young coconut palms and banana plants grew nearby, and dragon trees bloomed in the area. Not far away stood another hut that stored offerings for the god Eatua. A pole stood nearby with a bird wrapped in mats hanging from it. Inside this second hut, which was built on a small rise, they saw a woman sitting quietly, lost in sorrowful thought. When the group approached, she stood up and gestured for them not to come any closer. They offered her a small gift from a distance, but she refused it. Their Tahitian companions explained that the woman was associated with the marae, that the deceased was a woman, and that the mourner was likely engaged in the ceremonies of grief. So they left her undisturbed, and as soon as Mr. Hodges finished a drawing of the place, the group turned back. There was something powerful in the scene, something that invited reflection on religion. On the way back to the watering place where they usually landed and embarked again in the evening, the party passed a spacious house built in a delightful spot under a cluster of low coconut palms heavy with fruit. There they were offered a few small roasted fish sold for a pair of glass beads. Others from their company, not interested in eating, bathed in the sea. Afterwards they reappeared, dressed not in their usual clothing but in Tahitian-style a-house made of local cloth, which delighted the onlookers. The path led them along the coast past another marae, very similar to the one before. Beyond that, they reached a neat house where a very fat man lay stretched out, lazing in the most relaxed posture, his head resting on a wooden headrest. In front of him, 2 attendants were preparing his dessert. They mashed breadfruit and bananas in a large wooden trough, mixed in some of the fermented sour breadfruit paste called marae, and added water until the mixture was as thin as a drink. The instrument they used was a pestle made of polished black stone, likely a type of basalt. Meanwhile, a woman sat beside the man, feeding him generous handfuls of roasted fish and breadfruit, which he devoured with greedy appetite. It was obvious that his only concern was his stomach. In general, he was a perfect picture of sluggish indifference. He barely spared them a glance, and the monosyllables he muttered while chewing were just orders to his servants to keep feeding him rather than staring at the strangers. The great pleasure they had experienced during their explorations on the island, especially that day, was somewhat diminished by the sight and behavior of this high-ranking man. Until then, they had cherished the hopeful thought that they had found a small corner of the earth where an entire nation had reached a certain level of civilization while maintaining frugal equality among themselves, so that all ranks, more or less, shared the same food, pleasures, labor, and rest. But how quickly this beautiful illusion vanished at the sight of that lazy voluptuary, someone who wasted his life in the most indulgent idleness, offering no benefit to human society. He lived just as uselessly as those privileged parasites in so-called civilized countries who feast on the land's fat and surplus, while the harder-working citizens of the same society toil and starve in the sweat of their brows. The man's sluggish indulgence resembled the kind of luxury common among the elites of India and other eastern lands, a lifestyle often condemned. Sir John Mandeville, in his accounts of Asian travels, spoke with rightful indignation about it. That brave knight, whose values and courage were entirely shaped by the chivalric ideals of his time, lived a life of constant activity and grew especially angry when he encountered a monstrous example of laziness. Someone who let the days pass without a single nightly adventure and idled on forever like a pig being fattened in a stall. After they had watched this Tahitian glutton for a while, the group split up. Georg stayed with Mr. Hodges and Grindal. Since a kind young man who had carried Hodges's portfolio had asked them to visit his parents' house, they went along. It was 5 in the evening when they arrived. The home was small but tidy, and in front of it lay a stone terrace strewn with fresh leaves. There, a large selection of the finest coconuts and well-prepared breadfruit was laid out in perfect order. 2 older people, who stood nearby to keep rats away from the food, welcomed them. The young man ran up to them and introduced them as his parents. It was easy to see how delighted they were to have their son's friends as guests and to be able to serve them. They invited the visitors to enjoy the prepared meal. At first, Georg and the others couldn't understand how everything had been ready upon arrival. But it later became clear. Their young companion had sent one of his friends ahead a few hours earlier, likely to have the meal arranged. Since this was the first real meal of the day for them, they began eating with great appetite. What perhaps can't be imagined as easily was the joy shown by the kind-hearted parents and their thoughtful son, seeing how much their guests enjoyed the food. At the table, this elderly and dignified couple served them with such grace that the visitors almost forgot they were humans and could have imagined themselves as gods being hosted by Philemon and Baucis.
The reference to Philemon and Baucis in this passage evokes a famous story from ancient Greek mythology, told most notably in Ovid's Metamorphoses. In the myth, the humble elderly couple Philemon and Baucis unknowingly host Zeus and Hermes, who are disguised as weary travelers. Unlike their neighbors who refused hospitality, the couple offers the gods a simple but warm welcome. In return, they are rewarded for their kindness, and their modest home is transformed into a temple. By comparing the Polynesian hosts to Philemon and Baucis, the narrator elevates their grace and generosity to a mythic level. The moment transcends mere hospitality. It becomes a scene of reverence and quiet nobility. The visitors feel so honored that they nearly forget the human reality of their hosts and imagine themselves in a divine setting. The passage highlights the deep impression such encounters could leave on European travelers, who often framed extraordinary experiences through classical references familiar to their own culture.
But their inability to properly reward the couple reminded them all too clearly of their mortality. Nevertheless, they gathered what iron nails and glass beads they still had and gave them as small tokens of gratitude, more as a sign of thanks than true compensation for the kindness shown. When it came time to leave, the boy packed up all the food they hadn't managed to eat and carried it back to the ship for them. There, his friends gave him a hatchet, a shirt, and other minor items as a return gift. He seemed more than satisfied with this gesture, more than he likely expected, and returned joyfully to his parents that same evening. During their absence, trade had continued as usual, both on board and at the shore. Nothing noteworthy had happened, except that Captain Cook had met one of his old acquaintances again, Tuaia, who had accompanied him far during his last voyage around the island by boat. When they returned, they found Tuaia and 2 of his companions still on board, determined to spend the night with them. During Captain Cook's first visit while anchored in Maritime Bay, the islanders had often done this, but since the ship's current arrival, none had dared until now. Tuaia, already familiar with their way of life and the ship's contents, let the 2 less experienced companions explore everything with astonishment, while he immediately began an animated conversation. Tuaia asked about Tabane, Mr. Banks, Tolano, Dr. Solander, Tupaia, and several others he had once seen. He remembered all their names. It pleased him to hear that Banks and Solander were still alive. He asked the question several times, as if it deeply mattered to him, and always received the same answer. Finally, with longing in his eyes, he asked whether they might come to Tahiti again. When Tuaha learned that Tupaia had died, he wanted to know whether it had been from violence or illness. He seemed comforted to understand, through their broken words and signs, that Tupaia had died from sickness.
Tupaia was a high-ranking Tahitian priest, navigator, and diplomat who played a crucial role in the early phases of European exploration in the Pacific. Born on the island of Raiatea, he was trained in the sacred knowledge of navigation, genealogy, and religious ritual at the marae of Tapuatea, one of the most important religious centers in Polynesia. His expertise in traditional wayfinding allowed him to sail between widely scattered islands using the stars, ocean swells, bird flight paths, and other natural signs. When Captain James Cook arrived in Tahiti in 1769 during his first Pacific voyage, Tupaia joined the expedition aboard their endeavor. He quickly proved invaluable, not only as interpreter between the British and the Tahitians, but also as a cultural bridge and source of geographic knowledge. Tupaia created detailed maps based on oral traditions and personal voyages, outlining dozens of islands across the Pacific that Europeans had never heard of. Tupaia's name remained well known among Polynesian communities long after his death in 1770. He was remembered not just as a skilled navigator, but as a wise and respected figure who represented Polynesian knowledge with dignity in the face of foreign power. Tahitians valued him for his spiritual authority, his intelligence, and his loyalty to his people. To later Tahitian generations, he symbolized a time when their own traditions stood alongside European signs on equal footing.
They, in turn, asked what had happened to Tuaha, who had seemed like the highest-ranking chief during Cook's earlier stay. Tuaha explained at length. Although the details were not fully clear, the main points came through. A major naval battle had taken place between Tuaha and old Aheatua, father of the current king of Teiarrabu. Neither side had won. Later, Tuaha crossed the land bridge that connects the two peninsulas. There, in a fierce and unlucky battle, he was killed, along with Tuburai Tamaide and other high-ranking allies. Peace followed shortly after Tuaha's death, with Otu, who had previously been only a regent of Tahiti, taking over full rule. But old Aheatua did not enjoy his victory long. He died a few months later. His son, who had already held the ceremonial title Te Eri during his father's life, now inherited the real power of kingship. After Tuaha finished telling this piece of political history, they took out the chart of O Tahiti, the one engraved for Captain Cook's earlier voyage, and placed it in front of him without saying what it was. But Tuaha was too experienced a pilot not to recognize it immediately. Delighted to see an image of his homeland, he pointed with his finger to the locations of all the wenuas, or districts, and named them in the same order in which they appeared on the map. When he came to the district of Owhaiurua, which lay a little south of their current anchorage, he pulled at their arms to get them to look closely, and told them that not long ago a ship had anchored in that harbor. He always referred to it as Pahie no Pepe. It had stayed 5 days and received 10 pigs from the locals. One of the crew had deserted and was still living somewhere on the island. They suspected the ship had been Spanish. It seemed plausible that repeated visits by English ships might have drawn Spanish attention back to Tahiti, a place their nation had likely discovered first, and which was now close to their vast colonies in South America. This suspicion was reinforced, oddly enough, by the name Pepe. Although the sound was quite different from España, they believed it was likely a Tahitian distortion of the word. The people of Tahiti were already known to be even worse than Englishmen or Frenchmen at pronouncing foreign names. They asked Tuaha several more questions about this mysterious ship, but learned nothing beyond the fact that the deserter was still with Aheatua and had advised him not to give the newcomers any pigs. Whatever selfish or fanatical motives this man may have had, it actually seemed the most well-meaning and reasonable advice he could have offered his protector. The surest way to keep the wealth of his subjects within the country, especially the pigs, which were among their most valuable resources, and the best method to prevent new wants from arising among this happy people, was undoubtedly to force them to leave as soon as possible. And the most effective means of doing that was to deny them the very supplies they needed most. It was honestly to be wished that contact between Europeans and the inhabitants of the South Sea Islands would be broken off in time before the corrupt morals of more civilized nations could infect these innocent people who lived so happily in their ignorance and simplicity. But it was a sad truth that humanitarian ideals and the political systems of Europe did not go hand in hand. The following day, some of the crew who had taken a walk along the coast brought back news to the ship. They reported that they had met Aheatua and that he had come specifically to this district to grant them an audience. The men had been admitted to his presence without ceremony, and His Majesty had even shared half of his stool with one of the helmsmen, Mr. Smith. Aheatua had graciously declared that he would be pleased to see Captain Cook and would allow him to purchase any number of pigs, provided that he offered one axe in exchange for each. This was by far the most welcome news they had heard in a long time. The crew also claimed to have noticed a man whose complexion and facial features resembled those of a European. However, when they addressed him, he vanished into the crowd. Whether it had truly been a European, or whether Tuahao's story had simply stuck in their minds, they could not say for sure. What was certain was that none of them ever saw the man again. To take immediate advantage of Aheatua's goodwill, the captains, along with several officers, Dr. Sparman, Georg's father, and Georg himself, went ashore early the next morning. Opao, one of the islanders who had spent the night aboard, acted as their guide and suggested they follow the river from which the water barrels had been filled. After they had walked about 1 mile along this route, they came upon a large crowd. From what they could see, everyone had let their upper garments fall to bare their shoulders, an honor shown only to the king. They guessed that he must be nearby, and indeed they soon found him seated in the middle of the group on a large chair made of solid wood, which had been carried for him by one of his attendants. Aheatua recognized Captain Cook as soon as he saw him, and immediately made space for him on his seat. Meanwhile, Captain Furneaux and the rest of the group, including Georg and the naturalist's father, sat down on large stones. As soon as they were seated, a huge crowd of islanders pushed in from all sides and formed a tight circle around them. It quickly became so hot that the king's servants had to strike people back to make room and air for the visitors. Aheatua, the king of Tahiti, also called Teiarrabu, was a young man of about 17 or 18 years. He was well built and already stood 5 feet 6 inches tall, though it seemed he had not yet reached his full height. His expression was gentle but without depth, and if it showed any feeling at all during this first encounter, it was one of fear and mistrust, traits that do not suit majesty but often mark a troubled conscience or illegitimate power. His skin was lighter than that of his subjects, and he had straight, long, light brown hair with reddish-yellow tips. That day, his entire clothing consisted only of a wide sash of fine white cloth that reached from his waist down to his knees. His head and upper body were uncovered. On both sides of him sat commanders and nobles, most of them large and heavy-set men, a distinction likely due to their sedentary lifestyle and plentiful food. One of them, named Eatua, stood out not only for his massive size, but also for a peculiar kind of tattooing Georg had not seen before. His arms, legs, thighs, and sides were nearly covered with large black spots of various shapes. This man also seemed to hold special favor with the king, who consulted him in nearly every matter. As long as the young monarch sat on his wooden seat, or throne, he behaved with a seriousness and stiffness that one would not have expected from someone his age. It seemed like a rehearsed manner, adopted for the sake of making the audience appear more formal. Some old-fashioned statesman might have seen this as a virtue. To Georg and his companions, however, it was nothing more than a masquerade of pretense and affectation, something they had hardly expected to encounter in Tahiti. After the first greeting, Captain Cook presented Aheatua with a piece of red baize, a bed sheet, a broad carpenter's chisel, a knife, nails, a mirror, and glass beads. Georg's father gave him similar gifts, including a feather aigrette made of bright scarlet plumes fastened to a coiled wire that quivered like a spring. His Majesty valued these very highly, and upon seeing them, the entire crowd erupted into a loud "awa," a cry that expressed amazement and admiration. The king then asked about Mr. Banks, something that previously only Tuaia had done. After that, he inquired how long the visitors intended to stay, and said he would be pleased if they could remain for 5 months. Captain Cook replied that, on the contrary, he had to set sail again very soon, as there was not enough food to be had. Aheatua then reduced his request to 1 month, then to 5 days. But since the captain stuck to his decision, the king finally promised to send pigs the following day. However, similar promises had been made before, without anything coming of them, so the visitors did not place much faith in it this time either. Even though Teiarrabu couldn't be considered a highly sophisticated state, they had long since realized that the active kindness shown by the common people, through their hospitality and many helpful and generous acts, did not reflect the attitude of the court and its attendants. In contrast, the polished manners of the nobility seemed solely aimed at feeding expectations with empty promises, stringing them along from one day to the next. During this conversation with the king, the surrounding crowd, numbering at least 500 people, was at times so loud that the group could not even hear their own voices. The king's attendants had to shout, "Manu!" quiet, repeatedly, and enforce the command with solid blows from their staffs. When the Erie realized that Captain Cook truly would not extend his stay, he stood up and said he would accompany the group down to the shore. His servants had to carry his chair and the gifts he had received behind him. Now he shed the seriousness he had assumed during the audience and began chatting quite casually with even the lowest-ranking sailors. He asked Georg to name everyone from both ships who was currently ashore and wanted to know whether they had brought their wives aboard. When Georg answered no, His Majesty, in a burst of good humor, suggested they choose among the daughters of the land. But this invitation was seen as nothing more than a polite joke. Soon after, when they passed a house with reed walls, the king sat down in its shade, and the rest of the group sought shelter inside from the sun, which had now come out from behind the clouds. He asked for a few coconuts and began to speak about the Pahia no Pepe, or Spanish ship which Tuaia had first told them about. According to his account, the ship had been at Wairua 5 months earlier and had stayed there for 10 days. He added that the captain had hanged 4 of his sailors, while a 5th had escaped. They inquired for a long time about this European, whom they called O Pahutu, but could learn nothing about him. Eventually, when the courtiers of His Majesty realized how persistently and anxiously the visitors were asking about this man, they assured the group that he was dead. Later they learned that, around the same time the islanders had mentioned, Don Juan de Langara y Huarte had been dispatched from Callao in Peru and had visited Tahiti. However, no specific details of this Spanish officer's journey had yet come to light. While they all rested in the house, Eatua, the stout man whom they regarded as the king's chief advisor, asked whether in their country they had a god, Eatua, and whether they prayed to him. When Georg and his companions answered that they believed in a god who had created everything, though invisible, and that they were used to addressing their prayers and requests to him, Eatua seemed greatly pleased. He repeated their response with some likely explanatory remarks to various countrymen sitting nearby. He then turned back to them and said, so far as they could understand, that some of his own people shared the same belief. And indeed, several circumstances suggested that this simple and correct idea of the divine had been known in all times and lands, and that the complicated structures of absurd polytheism, which were found among nearly all nations, were merely the inventions of cunning minds who saw personal advantage in spreading such errors. Ambition, lust, and sloth had likely inspired the many heathen priests to the devilish idea of enslaving people's minds with superstition. It had not been difficult for them to implement this plan, since human nature was strongly drawn to the wondrous. This very tendency explained why those coinciding prejudices had become so deeply entrenched in the systems of human knowledge, to the point that they were still respected, even now, and thus the greater part of humankind continued to be blindly misled on this matter in the crudest possible way. Meanwhile, while Eatua was speaking about religion, King Aheatua played with Captain Cook's pocket watch. He observed the movement of the wheels, which seemed to move on their own, with great attention. Astonished by the ticking sound, which he could neither understand nor describe, he handed it back with the comment, "It speaks," parao, and asked what the object was used for. With much effort, the visitors explained that they used it to tell time, something that Tahitians usually judged by the sun's position in the sky. After hearing this, Aheatua called it a little sun to show he understood.
This concludes part 23 of Georg Forster's journey around the world aboard the HMS Resolution under the command of James Cook. I have linked a map of the locations of this episode in the show notes. So that was episode 23 of our journey around the world with Georg Forster, Captain Cook and the HMS Resolution, on which we will continue our travels together in the coming weeks. I hope we can travel a little further together, because life is a journey. Being part of it is everything.